I'm Nana van Tilburg for Biznews. Well, if the polls are correct, the ANC could lose its majority in South Africa's national elections, which have now been announced to be on the 29th of May this year. So what went wrong for the political party of Nelson Mandela? To shed light on this, we have businessman and independent political analyst Moeletsi Mbeki in the studio to discuss that. Hi, Moeletsi. Thank you for joining us.
Morning.
You've described it as the five deadly sins of the ANC. Why the biblical reference and what are these sins?
Well, I went to a Catholic high school in Lesotho. So I spent, which was a boarding high school. Yeah, during my era, you went to boarding high schools. So I had to have to attend Mass in the morning and Mass in the evening, although I wasn't a Catholic. So I got to learn a lot about the Bible and Christianity and Catholicism and so on. And actually, it turns out to be a very good reference in helping you understand the South Africa of today. So I recommend those who want to understand South Africa's problems to now and then have a look at the Bible. It will help to guide them.
So, what are your five deadly sins? Can we unpack them?
Okay, I identified five deadly sins that the ANC committed. First was not to privatize the state-owned enterprises that it inherited from the National Party regime. The National Party, of course, was largely a party of farmers. This is something that gets forgotten. So that was one side of but the economy was controlled by the mining industry. So for the farmers to become more productive, they had to build an infrastructure that reached the huge expanse of South Africa so that their produce could be delivered to the mining centers, which were the emerging urban centers. Nobody was interested in investing in that infrastructure because the mining industry was just interested in digging out for gold and diamonds. So the state had to build the railways. The state of the Afrikaner population, which was the National Party, had to build the railways. It had to build the infrastructure that the farmers required. So you had a whole lot of state-owned enterprises which were developed to service the agricultural sector. Now, the regime of that time understood that it had to train the people to be able to manage these industries. I think one of the most famous one was Van der Bijl, who set up the steel industry of South Africa. He was an Afrikaner engineer, metallurgist, whatever. He is the man who set up the steel industry of South Africa, which was called the Iron and Steel Industrial Corporation, which was also a state-owned because the mining companies and the London Stock Exchange, they were not interested in setting up a steel industry for South Africa. They told the South Africans, if you want steel, buy it from Birmingham or from Sheffield. What's your problem? You see, remember, we were a colony. So we have this network of state-owned industries that the ANC inherited, but it didn't have people to manage with the skills to manage. Remember, the National Party had been in power since 1924. So over nearly 70 years, it had developed people with the skills to manage these enormous industries. You know, the railway company was the largest company in Africa, not just in South Africa. The electricity company was the largest company in Africa. These were massive institutions, very complex organizations. The ANC, which had been there, as you know, the African people had been discriminated against, and their education had been undermined and undermined over many years. So they didn't have the skills. So when they became the government, it doesn't merely because you are the government, it doesn't mean you have the skills. And of course, as they say, the rest is history. They took over this instead of privatizing these enterprises. They tried to manage them themselves. Now, they understandably, of course, they failed. I mean, our electricity company has been in crisis for the last 16, 17 years, unable to provide the electricity that the country needs. But the government keeps saying, we'll fix it. But they can't fix it. They are not able to fix it. For 17 years, they've been unable. Interestingly, there was a study done by Harvard University. There was a team which came here, which did a study of South Africa over a 2-year period, headed by the distinguished Venezuelan economist called Ricardo Hausmann. And he pointed out that Chile had had a similar electricity crisis to South Africa, and that it took them 5 years to solve the problem. 17 years down the road, the ANC government still hasn't solved the problem. So, we underestimate the destructive power of Dr. Verwoerd's Bantu education. We want to forget the destructive power that it has had on the black population in South Africa, because we don't want to talk about it. If you talk about it, it seems like you are saying black people are inferior. No, it's realizing that they didn't have, and it was by design of Dr. Verwoerd and his buddies. It was by design that they didn't have the skills, and they should have had the leadership, the Mandela leadership in particular, should have had the wisdom to realize that they couldn't manage this company. Incidentally, one of the companies which was privatized of this state-owned was a company called SASOL. SASOL, which made petrol, oil from coal, was also a state-owned enterprise. It had to be state-owned because nobody was going to invest in such a crazy idea when the natural petroleum was available in the Middle East and very cheap. So why go to the expense? But of course, the then National Party government was afraid of sanctions. So it then developed this oil from coal that was privatized before 1994. Today, it's one of the most successful chemical companies in South Africa. It's got plants in Qatar, it's got plants in the United States, and so on. But South Africa doesn't lose anything. You see, many people think that when you privatize a company, the foreigners will put it in their handbag or in their briefcase and take it, I don't know, to where Switzerland or England or somewhere. This is the naive understanding of privatization. They think the asset gets taken out of the country. It's like the belief in South Africa. If the foreigners, I remember there was a debate some while ago when Richard Branson, bought a wine farm in Franschhoek. Then there was a whole hullabaloo. Oh, the foreigner is buying our wine farm, as if Richard Branson was going to take the farm and put it in a suitcase and take it to England. Well, the farm was still in South Africa, and it's still in South Africa. So, those are some of the challenges. Anyway, that's one. The second one, the ANC obviously wanted to develop a black middle class. And instead of developing the black middle class through developing the skills of the black population and developing entrepreneurship of the black population, they gave them affirmative action jobs in the public sector. So,
And highly paid affirmative action jobs.
and on top of that, enormously highly paid. So that was the second problem. Then they adopted. There was a process called Black Economic Empowerment, which was developed interestingly by Africana Capital, because at the end of the 80s, when Africana Capital, especially Sanlam, realized that the National Party, South Africa was going to have a democratic government. And there was a perception in the country that the Africana big companies like Sanlam had benefited from apartheid. So they were fearful that they were going to be nationalized or were going to be punished somehow. So these companies, led by Sanlam, tried to co-opt the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. So they started something, transferring shares to the leaders of the United Democratic Front in particular. So they set up a company called New Africa Investment Limited, which was given shares in a subsidiary of Sanlam called Metropolitan Life. So you then co-opt the leaders of the people who have been leaders of the people into defending the interests of Afrikaans big business and of big business in general, so that there is actually no economic reform of the economy. And then the where am I? I'm on three. The fourth one was turning a blind eye to the destruction of democracy and the economy of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a very important neighbor of South Africa. So what goes on there, it has impact. If you destroy the economy of Zimbabwe and democracy, there is going to be a flood of the displaced population into South Africa, which is exactly what happened. And also the other destructive process that was taking on was in Mozambique, where Frelimo, the ruling party in Mozambique, to finance itself, started importing heroin from South Asia and on selling it to South Africa. The ANC government turned a blind eye to that as well. The Americans found out that this heroin was leaking out to the United States, and they sent somebody to South Africa and they caught the person who was on selling this heroin to the United States, and they had him deported, and he was sentenced. He's sitting in a prison in New York as I'm talking to you. But we have done nothing. The report by the London School of Economics gave the names of who were the people who were importing this heroin to be on sold to South Africa. South African government should be having these people in prison in South Africa, but it has done nothing about it.
And one of your deadly sins is also BBEE. Why do you regard that as a deadly sin for the ANC?
No, no, you see, after a century and a half of exclusion of the black population from being able to, from skills for a start, because of job reservation, the majority of the black population had very low skills and had virtually had, they were not property owners, they were excluded from setting up companies. So after 1994, what we needed to do was to have a major drive to encourage the black population to become entrepreneurs, to raise their skill levels to become entrepreneurs. Instead, they were given wealth, pre-existing wealth, in existing companies. That's what black economic, on one side. On the other side, they were given highly paid jobs in the public sector. So We haven't developed new industries in South Africa since 1994. I think the only black-owned new industry, as far as I can find out, is MTN, the cell phone company. That's the only substantial black-owned in the company that has been developed during the last 30 years of the ANC. Why? Because professionals, black professionals, are in government jobs, highly paid government jobs, and many of them are in middle management in the existing private sector. They are not entrepreneurs. If you look at Asia, people ask, why is South Africa not like the Asian tigers? In the Asian tigers, there are no highly paid jobs in the public sector. If you look at, I once visited a steel plant, a plant making locomotives in China. The salary of the CEO, and this plant was in Sichuan. In fact, we buy locomotives from them. The CEO at the time was earning 300,000 rands a year, an equivalent. The guy who was running Transnet in South Africa his name was Brian Mulife, was earning 6 million rands a year. So we have this hugely paid public sector administrative class, which is taking resources from the production side of our economy that is functioning through the tax system to pay this massively overpaid uh, uh, administrative class. A few months ago, the government revealed that there were 55,000 public servants who were earning R1 million a year each. There was a project, just to give you an illustration how highly paid the ANC government is paying its own public service of it. There was a joint project between Germany and South Africa. And Germany had to engage South African public servants to administer the project, and it had to pay them. And the Germans found out that these guys are being paid more than German public servants. So they said, no, we're not going to pay more than civil servants in Germany are earning to these guys. So we've had a very destructive administration of South Africa during the last 30 years. People focus on corruption. Corruption is just a symptom. It is the key structural policies that are the fundamentals.
You talked about Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and also about removing the army from border control.
South Africa has more than 4,000 kilometers of land border. And if you take South Africa within the region in which we live, i.e., Southern and Eastern Africa, that's our region. South Africa it looks like an enormously wealthy country relative to its neighbors. And in many respects, it is. In GDP per capita terms, South Africa is nearly $7,000 per capita. But Zambia, Zimbabwe are in the hundreds. So when there's disruption in the neighboring countries, people see South Africa as the haven to which to come. And so they cross the borders of South Africa. Whatever border control, the formal immigration systems, they cross the borders irrespective. So, and now they put pressure on the poor in South Africa because they go to the neighborhoods of the poor. They don't go to the neighborhoods of the rich. They go to the neighborhoods of the poor. Like, for example, we have in just north of Sandton, a, an informal settlement called Deep Sloot. Now, there's a huge number of foreigners, poor foreign people who find their way from all over Eastern and Southern Africa into that. And this creates friction between our communities and with the foreigners, hence the so-called xenophobia problem in South Africa. But that's only one side of the problem. South Africa has to get involved in fighting or in pacifying Southern Africa. So through its membership of the Southern Africa Development Community, we have to deploy soldiers. For example, right now, South Africa is deploying to DRC to go and fight a rebel group called M23, which is supported by Rwanda. Now, Rwanda has teams of assassins in South Africa, which have killed one person, an opposition leader to the regime in Rwanda, and tried to kill another one. So if you don't control your border, these teams from M23, which you are fighting as part of your assignment by SADC, but SADC can't protect South Africa's borders from M23. So they can walk in. We are also in Mozambique, again, as part of a SADC peacekeeping, fighting some Islamist rebels or so-called Islamist rebels. What is to stop the Islamist rebels walking into South Africa and planting landmines and injuring South Africans? Nothing. If you don't control your border, they will walk across. Sooner or later, they will walk across. So that's why the South African army has been allowed to decline and decline because the funds that used to fund the South African army are being consumed by this civilian, highly paid administrative class. So our army, for example, there's been the experts point out that our attack helicopters, which are called the Rifle, are not operational because the pilots don't have enough time to fly, and there are no spares. So we have, for example, a troop carrier helicopter, which was shot at, by the way, a few weeks ago. But it was carrying an injured soldier, but it didn't have protection. It should have had protection from a rifle or from rifles, so that when it's fired on, they can return the fire. So that's the consequences of that's why I was saying those are our five deadly sins that have put South Africa to where it is today, on the verge of what one expert calls a failed state.
So, is there any absolution for the ANC? Because if we take your Christian analogy, will there be any forgiveness for the ANC, or would they be forgiven by the voters in the election coming up?
Well, at the end of the day, if we start with the Catholic practice, if you have sinned, you go to the priest and you go into the box, the confession box, and then you confess your sins, and you are told how many Hail Marys you should do, but you have to stop continuing to sin. The ANC, the confession box for the ANC is the electorate. And the ANC has made it clear it is not intending to change its ways. Ramaphosa has repeated time and again that he is sticking with the policy of Black economic empowerment, that he is sticking with the policy of this hugely highly paid administrative class. He is not changing the education system to produce the people with the technical capability of a South Korean population. No. So obviously, the population feels that after nearly 30 years, they've given them a chance to do it. And the ANC actually lost. People think it will be the first time that it loses the national election now. But actually, in the local government election in November 2021, the national tally of the vote, the ANC got 45.6% of the vote. So it has already lost the national election. It has lost all the metros, I think, except probably East London. We have 8 metros. The ANC used to control all the provinces and all the 8 metros. It has lost all of them, except the smallest, which is East London. It now is in power with coalition. Johannesburg, for example, is run by a coalition of the ANC and the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF. So it's clear that the population also realizes these 5 deadly sins and is stopping voting for the ANC. But of course, our other problem is that we have this fragmentation of opposition parties. But that, I see that as part of the democratic process of, because the ANC has been so dominant, the opposition has not been able to consolidate. So for now, the expectation is whatever government is produced by this coming election, the ANC will still be central to it, even though it will no longer be a majority party.
So, how has your 5 deadly sins been received since you've published it? What do people say to you about your assessment of the ANC's role
Well,
in South Africa?
I think there's been a shock. Uh, there's been a lot of response to the article that came out in the Daily Maverick. If you look at the online version of it, there's tons and tons of discussion. So in that respect, I think it's been very positive. Of course, not everybody agrees with me. For example, I got denounced by one or two for for putting the koi and the sun amongst the colors. They said, no, we were never slaves. so
Okay.
so but still, I think generally the discussion has been positive. On the government side, of course, I don't know what the government thinks of it all. But I think it has bigger problems than responding to the public debate.
Um, we, well, you've talked about the opposition parties. What kind of effect do you think that Jacob Zuma's, if it is Jacob Zuma's Umkhonto we Sizwe party, could have on this election?
Well, I think it's very clear from the 2 by-elections that it has contested that it has a strong following, at least in KZN, in KwaZulu Natal. It has come third in the 2 by-elections that have been held. IFP won, ANC was 2, and MK party was number 3. So it's very clear that it has a strong following in KwaZulu Natal from the by-elections. And because of our proportional representation system, a vote anywhere in South Africa goes into your national vote. Because we don't have a constituency system, a vote in KwaZulu Natal gets packaged into your vote for the national parliament. So I think it will make a showing at the national parliament, even if it just gets all its vote from KwaZulu Natal. But I think it will get a vote from other places anyway.
Well, all the polls are indicating that the ANC would fall below 50%. Do you want to predict what you think it might be, what they might get, what the opposition might get?
Well, we know that during the local government election, it went to 45%. So I don't expect it will improve on that 45%. But the rest, of course, we have lots of experts who are conducting opinion polls. But in the mid-40s, I think that's somewhere there way to. But either way, it's no longer the dominant party in South Africa. So in a way, I call it the end of the nationalist era. This coming election, it shows the end of the nationalist era, from Afrikaner nationalism when the National Party came in 1924 to when it left in 1994, and then African nationalists who came in 1994 to 2024 when they lost the majority. So we have reached the end of the nationalist era in our country's history. The interesting thing is, where do we go to from there? That is the more interesting question than the question of the ANC losing power. We know why the population no longer support the ANC, because of the 5 deadly sins. So the question is, how do we move forward?
Well, a lot of people would ask, how are we going to do with another 5 years of the ANC if they find a coalition partner? I mean, how do you see South Africa in the next 5 years and after the next 5 years?
Yeah, well, I think we'll continue with the stagnation we're sitting with, because, as I say, the president of the ANC has repeated that he's continuing with the current policies, which I describe as the 5 deadly sin policies. So he's planning to continue with them. Now, whoever is in coalition with the ANC will have to live with that. We'll have to maybe tinker on the edges of that. So South Africa is in deep trouble until we find a real democratic balance where we have 2 or 3 big parties that where we have real political competition. That's, unfortunately, anything can happen between now and then. But there is no other solution.
Well, that's not too positive to end off, but yeah, because I think people are actually hoping that the opposition parties can, get together and actually be a real force. So it's not going to be in this election, you say?
No, you see, one of the problems which I have identified with our political parties in general in South Africa, our political parties in South Africa only cater for minority interests. They don't cater for the interests of the mass of South Africans. If I take the DA, which is the second biggest party, okay, let me start with the ANC. Whose interests does the ANC cater for? It caters primarily for the interests of the African middle class, followed by the traditional leaders, followed by the rural poor. Now, this is a minority. It's not a majority of the people of South Africa. If you take the DA, during their launch of their manifesto, there was an interview with the chief whip of the DA. And she was asked, is the DA a white party? So she says, no, we are the most racially representative party in South Africa. So she said a third of our supporters are African, a third are colored and Indian, I think, and a third are white. Now, she calls that representative, but actually, it's not representative, because 80% of our population is African. So if the DA was not a minority party, 80% of its membership, not a third, 80 should be African. But Africans are leaving the DA. African leaders are leaving the DA for whatever reason, but they are leaving. So the Africans are a minority in the DA. So the DA is a party of minorities. If you go to the EFF has similar profile to the ANC. It has the middle class, that's who the EFF is, the African middle class. It has a following amongst the urban poor to some extent. It's trying to get a section of the working class, the African working class. But essentially, it is a part, again, it is catering for the interests of minorities. So, where are the majorities in South Africa? The majorities in South Africa are the African and the colored working class. That's the majority. And the rural poor. That's the majority in South Africa. So if you want an inclusive party in South Africa, it has to have the interests of those three groups as paramount. But of course, it has to include the middle class, but it also has to include the capitalists. We don't have such a party in this country. So we have these parties of various minority interests, but at the end of the day, they don't have enough power to move the society and to move the economy. South Africa has a complicated economy with many dynamics. You need a party that is inclusive of the big players in our society for you to have the power to reform, because those key players have to feel they are part of the decision making. But at the moment, they don't. That's why the ANC lost its majorities in Cape Town, in Johannesburg, in Durban, and so on.
Moeletsi Mbeki, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you. It's nice talking to you, Lynn.